Hi and welcome back to the course. In this video, we're going to set up uWSGI in our server. What we've done up until now is download our application from GitHub, our REST API. We've installed Python and pip and some development libraries that we needed. Then we've also installed virtual environment. We've created a virtual env, and we've installed the requirements.txt file in our application folder. So just to recap, what we did was we created a /var www.html items rest folder, and in this folder we downloaded from Git our repository, and we created the log folder, we created the virtual environment folder, and we set up a new virtual environment using Python 3.5, and then we installed the requirements.txt file, which includes everything that we need. This means that the stuff we've got here is nearly ready to be used. The only last thing that we have to change is a uWSGI.ini file, and we're going to do that in a moment. But first, we're going to create what's called an Ubuntu service. And a service is something that you can tell Ubuntu to run when the computer starts, when the server starts, and you can tell it to restart if it crashes and things like that. So essentially, a service is a descriptor of a program, and you can essentially set the service to run and restart and things like that. In addition, a service also lets you do things like set environment variables before the service runs, and which is going to be very useful. So let's get started creating the service, and I will explain as we go along exactly how things work, and when we're finished developing the service or creating this service, and you'll understand a bit more why it's interesting. So what we're going to do is say sudo vi, and remember this is going to open up a text editor which is called vi, and we're going to do this command as the root user, and the file that we want to edit is /etc/systemd, the system daemon, which is essentially just a program that runs and looks at things inside this folder, /system/uWSGI_items_rest.service. That's important, the .service at the end. All we're doing is creating a new text file, essentially, inside this particular folder, /etc/systemd/system, and Ubuntu, when we create a file which ends in .service and is inside this folder, it starts knowing that this is a service that it can run as a service using the system controller. And we're going to look at how to do that. So now here it asks for my password, which I'm going to put in. And then, as you can see, we create a new file. Down here at the bottom, you can see that the vi text editor is telling us this is a new file. So now there are a few parts to creating an Ubuntu service, but it's really quite self-explanatory as we go along. The first part is unit, and we have to type, of course, the I key first to go into insert mode, and then inside square brackets we're going to type unit with a capital U. What this is a section, and a section of a service allows us to define some properties of the service. And one of the properties we're going to define within this unit section is a description of the service. And the way we define a description is we say description with a capital D equals, and then we can say type in a description of our service. This is going to be useful, for example, when we run the service, it's going to say we are running this service that we are describing. And that's going to be useful for if an error happens, we can then go back and look for this description. It will appear in all the logs and things like that. So something that describes the service is useful, and I'm going to call it uWSGI items rest. I think it's fairly explanatory. We've got an items rest API. This is a uWSGI service that we're going to be running. So whenever we see this in the logs later on, we're going to know that this is what this means. This service here. The next section is service. So once again, inside square brackets with a capital S, we type service. And now we've defined the unit section. whenever the system controller runs this service, it's going to look at the unit section, find a description, and use that description. Then it's going to look at the service section, and it's going to look at all the properties we're going to define here, and it's going to run the service using these properties. The first property that we're going to define is environment. And remember to put a capital E, and what this does is it allows us to define an environment variable right before the service starts. Remember, this service is going to run uWSGI, and uWSGI is going to run our Flask app. So what environment variable do we need in our Flask app? I hope you got that. The environment variable we need is database URL. And that's because if you remember from the last section on Heroku deployments, we changed our app, our API, to use the database URL environment variable. And if you haven't done the last section, then I'll tell you now. Instead of sticking with SQLite, we're going to use PostgreSQL, as you know. And instead of hard coding the URL in the code, we're going to be defining the URL inside this environment variable. This is a variable that the server remembers. And then we're going to tell our Python code to read this environment variable to find out what the database URL is. And then it's going to access the database on that URL. And that's better than putting it in the code, because if we leave it in the code, people are going to be able to look at the database username and password that we have defined. So not ideal. Okay. So we're going to say database underscore URL equals, and here we go with the database URL for Postgres, which is Postgres : // This is necessary. You cannot skip this bit. And then we're going to type in our Postgres user that we created using create user earlier on in this section, which in my case is Jose. Then we're going to put a colon, and then we're going to put the password, which in my case is 1234. You may have chosen a more secure password, I hope. Okay, so that's the user, password. And then we're going to type in the @ symbol, and here we're going to put localhost. Localhost is the server that this programming is running on. So what this is going to do is it's going to try to access the Postgres server running on the same server as the app, using the username Jose and the password 1234. This does mean that we could access the Postgres server on a different server if we have it set up, which we don't. But potentially, if you wanted to separate your Postgres and your Flask servers, you could do that, and that would be fine. You would have to set up Postgres to enable you to do that. Finally, after the localhost, we're going to put a colon again and 5432, which is the port that PostgreSQL is running on, as we saw earlier in this section. Okay, so it looks a bit confusing. Username : password @ server : port. Okay, so the server is localhost in our case. Finally, at the very end, we're going to put a / and we're going to put Jose again. And now this is not the user, this is the database that we're accessing. So in my case, I've created a database called Jose to match my user, but potentially you could have created a database such as Full Stack or REST API or something. Sorry, that was misspelled. So this is just the database that you've created, and you must make sure that your Jose user has access to that database, which it most likely will by default. Okay, so that is the environment variable we're going to define. So right before running the Flask app, or the uWSGI app, which is going to run the Flask app, we're going to define this environment variable, and the server is going to know that this environment variable exists. Then our Python code is going to access it to retrieve this string there. Okay. Next, we're going to type exec start. Notice how the E is capital and the S is capital. And this is what program this service runs. Remember, a service descriptor is used to tell Ubuntu that this is a service that can be started when the computer or the server starts. It can be restarted if it crashes and things like that. And Ubuntu will take care of that for us. But we have to tell it what program we want the service to run. And in this case, we want to tell it to run the uWSGI program, which is then going to run our Flask app. Okay. So the way we tell it is by using the normal Unix notation for running a program. The first thing we do is we tell it the program name. So /var/www/items-rest/venv/bin/uWSGI. So when we've installed uWSGI, that has created an uWSGI executable file that we can run inside the virtual environment. So we have our project folder, the virtual environment folder, and then in the binaries folder, the bin folder, we've got uWSGI. We can run uWSGI, and that starts the uWSGI process. Then we're going to tell it --master after a space, remember? Space there, and then --master. And what this does is it tells it to use a master process. The master process is a way that uWSGI has of keeping track of other processes in case we use more than one. So it can restart them if they crash and if they get blocked and things like that. Then we're going to use --emperor, which is essentially a controller as well. And then we're going to tell it the configuration file for uWSGI, which is in /var/www/items-rest/uWSGI.ini. And we created this in the last section in Heroku deployments as well. And it's got essentially how to run the Flask app. That's what this file contains. It tells uWSGI what Python code it is meant to interact with. Then we're going to say --die on term. And that is essentially when we terminate the uWSGI process, that's going to kill the Python code as well. So it doesn't keep running in the background without doing anything. Finally, we're going to say --uid. And then I'm going to type in Jose, which is my username. You should type your own username here. And what this says is, please run the uWSGI process as Jose. Remember, in the past, we accessed the Postgres process as the Postgres user by doing something like sudo -u-i Postgres. And this is essentially going to do the same, but it's going to run the uWSGI process as the Jose user, which is good because Jose user owns this folder here. So the Jose user has access to doing everything inside this folder. And similarly, GID for the group ID, which is also going to be Jose. So we want to make sure that both the user and the group match the owner of this folder. And finally, we're going to tell it the log folder. So we're going to say log2 /var/www/items-rest/log/emperor.log. And what this is going to do is it's going to tell it where to write the log files for the emperor process. Okay. That's it. That's the exec start sort of property. And now, whenever we run this service using the system controller, it is going to run this command there. Before running that command, it's going to make sure that this environment variable exists. So after running this command, our Python code will be able to access the database URL environment variable. Finally, we're going to say restart equals always, and that's just going to mean that if the process crashes or stops, then Ubuntu, the system controller, is going to restart the process so it's not dead for a long period of time. Finally, we're going to give it a kill signal, which is sigquit. And this is a reasonably complicated Unix set of terminology. There are many different ways to terminate a process, but sigquit is one of them, and that doesn't force quit, essentially. So it tells it to exit, and then it will shut down gracefully without losing data and things like that. It's good to have that there. Then, sorry about that. We're going to type equals notify, and notify access equal all. So these are just notification parameters for this service. Finally, we're going to have a last section called install. And this is not a very good name for this section, and also not a very good name for the property wanted by multi-user.target. And as weird as it sounds, what this does is it allows us to start the service when the server boots up, which is rather a weird naming convention there. But nevertheless, that's what that does. So now we've got our service created here. And remember, every character counts, and every space and everything that we have typed here. So have a wee close look at this and make sure that you've got it exactly like that. And you should only change your username, password, and database, and also your UID and GID. The rest should stay the same. And when you're done, press the escape key, the ESC key, and :WQ to write and quit. And that's the service created. Okay? So that is pretty fantastic. And there is one last thing that we have to do as well, which is, as I mentioned earlier, change the uWSGI.ini file. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete all of that is here, because this was the Heroku uWSGI.ini configuration. And the way to delete things in Vi is to press the D key followed by Shift G. And that deletes everything. Then we're going to press the I key to go into insert mode, and we're going to be writing a few things here, so please bear with me. Once again, a section called uWSGI, that is going to be the only section in this ini file. And we're going to start by defining the base folder, where the uWSGI program exists. And that's just the base folder of our app. Then we're going to tell it which file to find the app in, which could be our app.py file, but it's in fact going to be our run file, because remember, or maybe you didn't follow the last section, but in the last section, the run file was created to make sure that the database was initialized before the app was ran. So that's important. And the module that we're importing is the same one, so app. And what this does is that loads this variable there. And so the module we're importing is the app module, which is the run.py file. And uWSGI is going to use this variable later on. Okay, the home of the uWSGI process is the base folder /venv, because it lives inside the virtual environment uWSGI does. And apologies, this should not be a $, it should be a % symbol there. That's how we use previously defined variables like that. The Python path. This is a pretty funny environment variable as well. But the Python path essentially defines where your Python project begins. So what is the root folder of your Python project? And in this case, it's also the base folder. Now, the socket file is in the base folder /socket.sock. Don't know if you guys remember that we defined this earlier on in this section. And the socket.sock file is essentially what is going to allow communication between the uWSGI process and Nginx. And so it's going to be a file there that allows that communication. The socket must have permissions of 777. So we are going to change the permissions of the socket to 777. And I'm not going to get into exactly all the Unix permissions, but just remember 777 means that anybody can access the socket file. Any user in the system and any group in the system can access the socket file. That's what this means. And that's important to make sure that Nginx can access the socket file. Okay. Then we're going to tell it the number of processes that we want. And I'm going to say 8, although that may be a bit high depending on what sort of droplet we're using. But the processes is a matter of playing around with it and if things don't go well or they are too slow, you can try and play around with that. It's not something I normally change. And threads, I'm going to give it 8 as well. So each process is going to have 8 threads. Again, this is something you can play with. It depends on the processor that you're using. In many DigitalOcean boxes, this may be a bit too high, but nevertheless. Then we're also going to define the harakiri, which is going to be 15 seconds. And the harakiri comes from the Japanese thing that the samurais did, which is essentially kill themselves if they did something wrong. And here it means the same thing. If one of these threads gets blocked or has an error and it shuts down, then after 15 seconds, we're going to destroy the thread and create another one. And the emperor, the uWSGI emperor, is going to be responsible for that. Finally, we're going to define a callable, which is going to be app. And this app is not the file app.py. This is the variable app that is imported in the run.py file. So what uWSGI is going to say is going to get this module, and it's going to find this variable in the module, and it's going to run that Flask app. So that's important there. And also we want to define a place to log the Python app output. So this is exactly what you saw in your terminal when you ran your Flask app, such as the requests coming in and the errors and things like that. We want to log them somewhere, and the where we want to log them is /var/www/html/items-rest/log. That's the log folder we created earlier. And then %n.log. %n is essentially going to be uWSGI. So it's going to log the Python output to uWSGI.log. Okay. That's it. So press the escape file and :WQ will write and quit. And remember, what we've done here is told the uWSGI process how to run the Python code. Okay. And finally, we can start up our Flask app by doing sudo system controller, systemctl, start uWSGI_items_rest. This here is the name of the service that we defined earlier, and that is going to go into the service, run the execstart command, which is going to run uWSGI, which is going to look at the uWSGI.ini file, which is going to run the Flask app, and create the socket file, which is going to communicate with Nginx to route the requests to our Flask app. So hopefully all that makes sense. And once again, we need the password in here. And that's it running. Now, the first thing to do once we do this is to go into the log folder and look at the uWSGI log. Then we're going to go down to the very bottom and see if things are working fine or there is a problem. As you can see, we've spawned the uWSGI processes, but there's nothing else left down here, so we may have accessed this a bit early. I'm going to type :Q to exit and then access the log file again, and we're going to go down to the very bottom again to see if there's anything new there. Nothing new. So we're going to then run the app and see what happens. So I'll see you in the very next video, and then we're going to look at the logs again after running a request and see if more things appear there or not. If things don't appear, it means that somewhere our connection between Nginx, uWSGI, and our Flask app has gone wrong, and the requests are not reaching the Flask app. And if things do appear, then hopefully it's not an error, and then everything should be working. So without further ado, let's go over to the next video, and we're going to look at that.